Okay, I think we're recording now. Welcome everyone to Vietnam Part 2. This one has visuals. And I teachers don't usually say this, but I left you a little confused by the last video, because as I like to say, I've been studying the Vietnam War for decades now, and I'm still confused by it. So it's good to have a little bit of confusion. Why are we involved in another country's civil war? Why, despite the unpopularity at home, this war lasts for the better part of 10 years. So we really need to be examining that as we go along, though, and keep asking the questions, why? And of course, we can end up with containment and our hyper focus on us versus them in the Cold War, us being the good guys, them, the communists, being the bad guys. But this first poster is just a huge nod to the unfairness of the war, and the unpopularity of the war and the unfairness. I'm gonna tell you why exactly. Other than just really feeling that we didn't need to be sending all those soldiers over there, committing all the resources, young men dying in the jungle in Southeast Asia. Many people couldn't even find Southeast Asia on the map. But there was a huge anti-war movement, and again, I'll get more into that. So here's a great poster. What if they gave a war and nobody came? So here's your outfitted soldier. The soldier's not in there, obviously, but here's like a scarecrow version of just the war regalia with the doves all over it. And obviously, the doves are the sign of peace. So we can't forget the war went into the 70s, of course. It ended in 73. And also going on in the 70s in this country was the women's movement. So there's my poster. Don't show your parents that poster. So it's just a reference to the growing women's right movement and the fact that they're finding their voice, and women were, like many others, denouncing the Vietnam War. All right, so again, we can't forget what's going on concurrently in our nation. We can't forget that we're also embroiled in the civil rights movement simultaneously. 1964 is when the Gulf of Tonkin resolution got us officially involved, boots on the ground, as I like to say. We officially went from advising in Vietnam to sending troops to Vietnam in 1964, and we know the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was right there. We're right in the middle of the civil rights movement. So here we have a soldier getting a note from Selma, Alabama in March of 1965. Again, remember the March on Selma that led to the Voting Rights Act of that year. And here we have a soldier very upset by the news in Selma. Obviously, a loved one was hurt or wounded, hurt or killed in that march. Also, I'll start now. One of the other connections of African Americans and the protest of the war is African Americans served percentage-wise in larger numbers than percentage of their population in the United States, and a higher percentage of troops in Vietnam. And we'll talk more about that. Okay. So here we go. We don't have the restrictions that we did in, say, World War One, where due to those espionage and sedition acts, freedom of speech was limited, protesting was limited, socialists couldn't print pamphlets, things like that. It was not as limited in Vietnam, and you see here this whole mocking of the Montgomery flag. I want you recruitment poster. I don't want you to go to war. I want out of the war. So here's Uncle Sam as like a more of a soldier, more of a victim, and I want out. So this poster would have been completely, outlawed during World War One. So you see the increase of freedom in protesting and speaking out. So that's an interesting parallel. So some of the reasons for the unpopularity. So as we get into this, because we really need to get that why. Why was it so unpopular here? Stop the war on Vietnam. Not the war in Vietnam. Stop the war on Vietnam, this pin says. Vietnam for the Vietnamese. Like, we are involved in a civil war. Remember that dividing line, the 17th parallel. Remember that remember the elections that didn't happen. They were supposed to unify their country. They're completely in a civil war, North versus South, not maybe unlike our North versus South civil war. So we need to get out. We have no business there, is what this pin is saying. Now this, we didn't go over this before. It's a very significant. These two images are probably two out of the four top images of Vietnam. This is self-immolation of a South Vietnamese monk, Buddhist monk. Remember, the South Vietnamese was basically controlled by the capitalists, foreigners, French, if you will. Remember, Diem was Asian in looks only. He was Western in dress, in speech, in religion, everything else. So, and he was very, the people of South Vietnam, the traditionalists, the traditional Vietnamese people in South Vietnam were very upset. He tried to close monasteries. He tried to close Buddhist monasteries. He tried to close and harm the people, the communists or northern sympathizers in South Vietnam. And this is a picture of a monk protesting Diem's rule in the South, who, don't forget, the U.S. supported Diem. So here we have a monk lighting himself on fire. There's no return. He's going to die here. Lighting himself on fire, protesting the leader in South Vietnam the U.S. supports. So this is huge, showing that people of Vietnam do not support Diem. So here is a picture from the Tet Offensive. That was when the South Vietnamese, or the Viet Cong in South Vietnam, sorry, not the South Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, who were the South Vietnamese who were on the side of the North. Okay, so they were communists living in the South. Again, many traditional Vietnamese people lived in the South. It wasn't all, foreigners. It wasn't all Westerners. It wasn't all Western thinking Vietnamese people. They're very much traditionalists, and people who supported the North, and they were called Viet Cong, and they lived and fought in the South. So here we have a South Vietnamese army soldier that we are supporting. Here is a suspected Viet Cong in the they found amidst them in the South, because they lived in the South, and here we have a South Vietnamese soldier shooting an unarmed suspected Viet Cong. Is there a trial? No. Is there, any type of justice? No. He just shoots him point blank in the streets of Saigon during the Tet Offensive. So that is extremely upsetting to American people at home, as of the monks lighting themselves on fire, support, in protest of people we're supporting. Who's the good guy here and who's the bad guy? We've been told the Viet Cong is the bad guy, again, because they support the communists. And here we have a South Vietnamese soldier shooting what looks like a kid to us in the middle of the street without a trial. So here we have the boy next door. This is, I always say, if you looked around the room in Westboro in 1964, 65, 66, all the way through the 70s, this is what the boy sitting next to you might look like, I propose. And he is most likely what the average soldier might look like in Vietnam, from a town like Westboro. So that's look how young he looks, look how innocent, and that's just sort of that. So below is probably the most famous picture of Vietnam, and above is very significant because we're going to talk about what the basis of the protest at home, one of the biggest reasons, and it was for the draft. So below, again, and these pictures that keep coming out of Vietnam about what's happening in Vietnam, obviously, are also reasons for the protest, but I'm going to propose draft is number one, and this is number two. So we're going to go in order. So burn draft cards, not children. This is a napalm attack against South Vietnam, where we are. This is where the good guys are, and we're supposedly the good guys, and this is what we're doing to our allies. So what's happening is we are bombing with this napalm, this jellied gas. It's an exfoliant, because we're trying to get rid of the jungle so that we can find the supply line that North Vietnam is supplying the Viet Cong, who are fighting and living in the South. So we are trying to find that supply line, which we pretty much cannot, and we are bombing South Vietnam with jellied gas, in order to get rid of the jungle to find the supply line. This is what's happening. These children were sadly harmed in the raid. This girl does not die. Later, if you watch the Ken Burns series, they do find her. She does not die as a result of this. Still, this is horrific. Okay, so draft. So what's wrong or unfair about the draft? Okay, well, the thing about the draft, burn draft cards, not children, again, tying into this, but the problem with the draft is that it is completely unfair. That you can get deferments from the draft, or deferred or not drafted to Vietnam, if you have several things. College enrollment. There were deferments for college. You could not go to Vietnam if you had a doctor's note. You could not go to Vietnam at some point if you were married, had children, or had certain jobs, such as a teacher. So remember, the shipbuilders of World War II wouldn't get drafted. Well, in Vietnam, you could be a teacher or have some other essential job. So those were some of the reasons for draft deferment. So let's go back and think. So we said that African Americans were drafted at much higher rates per population than whites. African Americans did not attend college at the same rates that whites did, and even poor whites did not attend college at the same rates that more affluent whites did. So this becomes a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. So all you had to do was send your kids to college, and they didn't have to go. Of course, there's the National Guard. You could get, if you knew someone, you could get your kids in the National Guard, and that's the home army, obviously, and do that. Or you can get a doctor's note. And let's face it, who get doctor's note? What doctor would risk their reputation or license for some or city kid, right? It's who you know. If your dad's at the club and has a friend that's a doctor, well, maybe you could get a doctor's note. And again, teachers, educated. So you're starting to see it's a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. So it kind of goes back to the Civil War, where you could pay someone to go and fight for you. That's kind of the same thing that's happening here with all these draft deferments, and the poor are going. And then, of course, people are protesting, and people are burning draft cards, and some are even basically escaping to Canada and Mexico. They're leaving the country. And of course, that's illegal if you're drafted to dodge the draft. So those draft dodgers, if they ever came back, would be subject to, the penal system. So here we have what's called the hippie movement, make love, not war, completely anti. So these might be some of your draft dodgers. And you can tell, again, the way they're dressed with the facial hair and the loose clothing, that they are anti-war. And here is, I believe this is the National Guard, and he's putting flowers in their rifles. So again, showing peace, not war, that we need to stop this war for many reasons. Okay, so anti-draft week, again, can't stress this enough. March, they had a whole anti-draft week. This whole movement, Students for a Democratic Society, there's hippies, there's all kinds of people protesting. And then in the Johnson era, and then Nixon gets elected. Johnson, remember, doesn't even run in 68. Nixon gets elected, and he does a few things. So Nixon bugs me, is one of my favorite pins. Nixon does change the draft system. He changes it to a lottery system. So that makes it much more fair, so that you can't get a deferment based on college or doctor's notes, things like that. You could go for your physical and be 4F or whatever, but you can't just have a random doctor's note anymore, or a college deferment. So Nixon does go to a lottery system. So starting in 1970, everyone's birthday was put in a big, like, I would say, like the bingo cylinder, and they picked out the numbers based on birthday, because what is more equalizing than a birthday, right? It crosses race lines, it crosses not gender, but it crosses race and socioeconomic lines. So that's Nixon did make it a fairer draft, and then he started the Vietnamization of the war, making it withdrawing the troops. So making a fair draft and withdrawing the troops. But don't worry, he's not perfect. So we'll see this. So this map shows Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is super important, because if you didn't get who the Viet Cong were. Now it's very clear here. So the fighting was done in the South. So the fighting is done in the South. We do bomb the North. Um, we do air raids and bombing on the North, and so mining of the Haiphong Harbor, Gulf of Tonkin was an incident. But we do not invade and fight in the North. We just bomb. So all the fighting happens below the 17th parallel, and it's all in South Vietnam, which is where they're our allies. Remember that we're fighting on the behalf of the South Vietnamese army. We're fighting with the South Vietnamese army to defeat the North. And remember, in the South are the Viet Cong. They are the communist northern sympathizers, but they are the South Vietnamese. Okay, for the most part, the South Vietnamese are sympathetic to the Viet Cong. Otherwise, the people that are communists in the North Vietnamese are simply the North Vietnamese army or the Viet Minh army. So the Viet Cong are the South Vietnamese that are sympathetic to the Viet Minh or the North Vietnam or the communist side. So remember, South Vietnam, once you get out of the cities, away from the capitalism and the French imperialism, they're just farmers. They're just people who want to farm. They want to pass on their land to the next generation. They care about their crops. They care about their children. They care about their water buffalo. They're simple people, much like what happened in Korea. Do they really care about capitalism? Do they really care about? They really don't. Once you get into the country, they just want survival. They want their way of life. They want their culture, and again, they want to be able to pass things on to their children, whom they love just as much as Americans love their children. So the Viet Cong supply, or the communists supply the Viet Cong who are fighting in the South through this Ho Chi Minh Trail, and you can see that this trail goes through the neighboring countries of Laos and Cambodia. And remember, I told you about that picture with the little children running. I have to stop here.